Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. As you would know, this is the Director's Hour. For those of you who already have attended some of our Director's Hours in the past, those who are new to our platform, this is a platform and a conversation we have once a month, and it's for directors, executives, and those people interested in governance. So what we do is we choose a topic and which we think would be relevant to this particular audience, and we have a discussion on it. If we have the privilege of getting an expert on a particular field into the room, then we do so as we have done today. So with me in the Director's Hour today is Professor Erwin Schwella. Erwin is Professor Emeritus of the Public Leadership Law School in Tilburg University, the Netherlands, at the Tilburg University. He's also previously from the School of Public Leadership at the University of Stellenbosch. He's currently Dean of the School of Social Innovation at Hugenote College in Wellington. But more so, he's an experienced CEO and board member. We had a conversation and we stumbled upon the concept of compromise, a concept that can be deployed either as positive or negative. In its positive sense, it means I'm hearing you, I understand you, and that's why I'm working with you, and we get to a place where we can even render a policy so that we can get some democratic benefit from that. From a negative point of view, it means a bit different. It means I'm falling short of my professional standards. Things are not really looking up as they should. And based on this conversation, we agreed that Erwin will address this issue of a compromised citizenry in that space. Erwin, welcome to this forum, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fred. Much appreciated. As it happens, I think it's an exciting topic, and particularly the idea of reflecting on this. I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation, but I would prefer not to go through the slides. I'm aware of the fact that the joke that I often use says, you know, academics are the only people who speak in other people's sleep. Maybe dominees or ministers of religion also do, and maybe politicians also, but at least academics, we do that. So I don't want to use the slides, I want to speak to it. And then when I do that, I'm going to basically cover the topic, first of all, by introducing some of the context and challenging issues. Then over time, we will get to some of the conceptual material. What does compromise mean? And Frick, you've already referred to that. Because compromise can be, we make a compromise and we get together and we get along. But it can also mean that in some ways we start to live with failure and accept suboptimal solutions. So we want to have a more deep understanding of compromise through reflection in this particular context. And by the way, the whole idea of reflection also links to one of my colleagues from the Netherlands, from the Free University, Professor Gerda van Dijk, and there might be others also joining from that side, because they have a very interesting concept where they deal with things such as integrity in institutions by what they call the reflexiekamer or the reflection room. So some of the ideas that I share here and the methodologies, I also give credit to my Dutch colleagues, who are some of them on this particular meeting today or in this forum. Okay, so then I want to talk about context and challenges, some of the concepts on compromise, the concerns we have about that, and then the capacity to deal with it. And finally, a final C, I like alliteration, a final C, which is what is the change that we require? Now, when we talk about a compromised citizenry, and I will introduce in that way, and then Frick will come in and pose some questions. Please also watch the chat box. As it happens, as I am focusing currently on the slides. Frick will watch the chat box and can introduce some of your questions to me in an audio way. Now, back to the compromised citizenry and specifically the South African context. I accept and I am very pleased that South Africa is currently still a constitutional democracy. That constitutional democracy has a history. We know about the excesses and the serious immorality of the apartheid state. We will take that into consideration. That was fundamentally a problem. But if we look at what happened since the inception of our constitutional democracy, it hasn't been a trouble-free start. And in some ways where we are now reminds me of the well-known statement of Dickens in A Tale of Two Cities. And I will just recall that for current purposes. Dickens at the time, many years ago, said it was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light. It was a season of darkness. It was a spring of hope. It was a winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going directly to heaven. We were all going directly the other way. And in some ways, when I get up in the mornings with my normally optimistic viewpoint, and if some concerns then start to raise with me, then I think about this quote. And it basically says that we have so much potential in South Africa. We can create so much prosperity. But unfortunately, through a number of issues, even post-democracy, based on a very bad history of apartheid, we seem to have lost the plot. And that maybe leads me for now into just the second point I want to make, and that is that in South Africa, in the context, I have identified 4 broad areas post-apartheid. Apartheid was a disaster. We can talk about that, but it's not what is necessarily on the agenda for today. It was not for no reason that it was declared a contravention of global human rights matters, also formally. The post-apartheid eras that I have identified, and I try to make them interesting, is also then linked and juxtaposed to what I have said in the context related to Dickens. And basically, we had 4 eras as far as I can discern. It was Mandela magic, and there we had the positives of wisdom, belief, light, hope, promise, and in inverted commas, heaven. Then Mbeki, what I call the Mbeki mix, a tale of 2 terms. The first term of President Mbeki, we had 6% growth. We were doing very well. The second term, also due to global issues and challenges, it became, in actual fact, fairly problematic, and it resulted in his removal at the Polokwane conference, for those South Africans who know. And the first term seemed to be great. The second part of that term became problematic. Then I have an era which I call the Zuma-zaster, and that I actually capture as from Amandla to Nkandla. It was then linked to the ideas in Dickens, which was foolishness, incredulity, darkness, despair, panic, and going the other way. And then the fourth area in which we are now is what I call the Ramaphosa era, is blossoms after the burn or the fire. Now, that sets the scene in terms of how South Africa has continuously, in some ways, transitioned and transformed, and from hope to some forms of hopelessness. And what I think has happened, and then I will conclude for now and maybe take a question or two from Frick, is that why did this become the case? First of all, the reason for this kind of ambiguity, for this kind of continuous fluctuation between hope and despair, starts with material conditions of the society. What we have globally and in South Africa is increased real and perceived scarcity. What I mean by that is if you just look at the sustainability link, then it is just so that World Overshoot Day globally, which is the point where the global carrying capacity is exceeded, and therefore we go into overdraft, is more or less at the end of July, whereas when it was started as a measure, it was the end of December. So globally, it seems as if there's a kind of an imbalance between what the global population needs in terms of a sustainable livelihood and what is actually available. And that actually means that there is real scarcity, and that means competition builds up. And people want to simultaneously, while there is scarcity, they want to deal with the big issues. In South Africa, the big issues being poverty, inequality, and unemployment. And that then becomes very difficult, especially if you have a bad starting point, and if that is then followed by a period within which something occurs, such as the Zuma disaster. So that's the first point. There are real and perceived scarcity. And the perceived scarcity come in where people say that although I have become privileged, I still feel I'm not privileged enough. That links to the second issue, and that is the human condition. And that I qualify in terms of my thesis here as between need and greed. There is a small elite in South Africa which seemingly has a rapacious, insatiable greed. And then there's a large disadvantaged community which have dire and disastrous needs, real needs. And then when you get a situation where experiences start to rule at the cost of discernment, so people work in their experience. And that links into what I think is part of the solution, but currently a problem. It starts to create a situation where, for the competition of the available opportunities, integrity goes out of the window, compassion goes out of the window, and empathy goes out of the window, and reciprocity, where we find that people want things, but they don't give anything back. They just want to receive, they don't want to give. And then that then impacts on being and becoming a compromised citizenry. Now, maybe I should stop there for the moment, and Frick is following this, you are following it, and Frick can maybe just give us an opportunity to maybe consider a couple of your thoughts and questions up to now, and then we can continue from there. I hope this methodology works, because I would like to involve not only a talking head, but some interactive and co-constructive reasoning and thinking. Frick, over to you.
Thanks, Erwin. So I haven't seen any questions in the chat box yet, but if I listen to you in describing the different eras which you did, so I kind of get a feeling that we are saying that our democratic credentials are impoverished in some way or another, so that our democratic ideals that we had, you would know from previous conversations, my mantra is Africa is too rich to be poor, because we have so much on this continent. We have the most arable land on this continent. We have 42% of the world's natural resources. We have this youth dividend that we have on this continent, yet we are the poorest continent, back to what you have said in terms of poverty. And I'm asking myself, can democracy alone get us out of that poverty, out of that? Do we need something else apart from democracy to get us out of that and to enjoy the wealth that we are really sitting on this continent, and particularly in this country?
Frank, it's a very profound question, and it links to probably the most philosophical thought that I could ever, as it were, emerge from my own thinking. And it is very philosophical, but it's also very practical, because it links on the first level of analysis, politics and economics. It's about the political economy. And then it also involves the social and the technological and the ecological aspects. And for those of you who have done scenario analysis and trends analysis, that comes very close to the step or the pestle type of idea. Now, what is this philosophical question? Societies under conditions of perceived and real scarcity are faced with serious wicked problems. And basically, the philosophical formulation of that is, how do societies, and that includes politics, economics, social and technological, as well as ecological matters, how do we create, how can we create, if you want, wealth or public value? Because societies have to create wealth and public value. But also, how do we share wealth and public value? Because if you only create, then it becomes, in a certain sense, a process of amassing that for your own purposes in terms of a form of greed. You must also have a theory and a model and a set of policies to share it. So it's about creating and sharing. And then, secondly, you have to create ethically, and you also have to create effectively. You have to share ethically, and you have to share ethically. So then you can visualize a four-self typology where politics, economics, society, technology, and ecology should co-create value and share value effectively and ethically. In that particular calculation, democracies are important political mechanisms which has the capacity and the authority to help with the questions of creating and sharing. But it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for a successful society. You have to build, and our president calls it the social compact. And if you don't have that, and it fails because of the human condition of greed and need, where that goes wrong, and there's not a balance, and there's not legitimacy of the state, there's not efficiency in economy and effectiveness in economy, there's not consensus but rather conflict in society, there's technology which marginalizes, and where there's an ecology that then becomes unsustainable, then you get into what I call the consequences, which leads into a compromised citizenry. Now, what is that? This is where the forces of evil start to gain foothold. And you get the typical thing where power starts to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, according to Lord Acton. The greed becomes prevalent and it conquers. The poverty and equality and unemployment sustains. That becomes sustainable. The corruption starts to kill. And in South Africa, if you look at all of the political assassinations that we have, it's all about finding scarce resources and finding some way of in some cases, people who aspire to political positions will kill not only their political opponents, but their political party compatriots in order to get into the system under dire consequences, where there's so much poverty, inequality, and joblessness. And if we're not careful, we'll get into what Thomas Hobbes called the bellum omnium contra omnes, a war of all against all. We should be very careful that we don't get into a race for the bottom, where we become highly competitive for less things which become scarcer, And in some ways, if we into that kind of toxic mix, then we all become compromised. And if we go along that way, we may see the Rwanda scenario playing out, where those who are not in our ambit, whether they are foreigners or whether they are locals or whether they're somebody from the others in our communities, where they become the cockroaches. And if we go into that rhetoric, then we amplify the conflict, and that might lead us into a bellum omnium contra omnes, a war of all against all. And I will get to how we get compromised, how we get sucked into that toxic situation in a gradual way. There's a dynamic that plays out there, and we must all be careful, whether we have influence or not, that we don't get in there. So these are there's always, in scenario planning, there's possible futures, probable futures, and desired futures. If we're not careful, we can get to a apocalyptic possible and even probable future. But for now, before I then go on to explain how the process plays out, the dynamic of the process of becoming compromised, not only as an individual, but as the citizenry. And of course, there are many good people in South Africa. I was very impressed with the president saying in yesterday's celebratory speeches, our president Ramaphosa saying, South Africans and the great majority, there are many more good people than bad people. They don't want to have a government that steals from them. They don't want to have a political party. In this case, the president mentions the ANC. I wouldn't do that. I of course, I'm very diplomatic and considerate. But if the president says the ANC doesn't want to be a party that is known for stealing from the population, then we can all agree with him. So for now, Frick, maybe we can take up the conversation again.
So one of the questions popping up here is, considering what is required to level the playing fields between rich and poor, is the free market system the best vehicle to reach this objective?
Yeah, that's setting me up for an interesting debate. I'm not a believer in ideology. In some of the slides which follows, and whether we get there or not, I argue that ideology is a serious issue. Ideology is actually power rather than authority, and it's actually ideas then linked to power. And I believe that all of these things, like capitalism and socialism and communism and whatever they may be, they tend to be ideological. And when they are implemented with power, then they become problematic. In that sense, and there's a debate there in terms of how do you create and share public value or prosperity or whatever you want to call it, effectively and ethically. I would be a pragmatist. Now, there's another ism there, but I would say what you have to do is you have to do what works. So whether it's I think it's fairly naive if you think about models of the state, and there's another discussion that we can have, a very interesting conversation. Models of the state. The model of the state in South Africa, given our context, if we think we can have a merely night watchman state, a state that comes in when there are serious problems, well, maybe they won't even arrive for that. But then I think we are seriously misled. Our state has to be, in some ways, an active state. It doesn't have to be a nanny state, but it has to be an active state which starts to become, and in that sense, I will show my particular preference. We need a competent developmental state. And that means it's competent and it's developmental. We don't need an incompetent developmental state. And therefore, I don't think the market or the free market or a completely free market, if that is in any case a reality anywhere in the world, which I don't think it is a reality. Probably the freest market in the world is China. There might be some issues there. point is, I'm very careful to say, and I don't think we can get away with an ideological view saying that the free market will solve our problems. We need to be pragmatic and have a balanced composition of a set of things that invokes notions in the political area, the economic area, the social area, the technological area, as well as the ecological area.
I have a sense, Erwin, that given what you say about an ideological position, that an ideological position is almost either or position, and we need a both and position in this place to be pragmatic and to solve this environment. I want to circle back to something that you have said in terms of, well, two things that you've said: the coming together of that typology and to create that ecology. What is the role of the three concepts that you have mentioned: integrity, empathy, and compassion, in making that a success? And what is the lack of that in the current doings of state and business and citizenry in South Africa?
Well, Frick, in my more, shall we say, media related and let's say conversations that in some ways sort of want to introduce some controversy as well. My point would be that, you know, integrity essentially is dignity, and it takes you away from yourself. It says that dignity says that you have to have some empathy and compassion for the other, and it maybe links to also reciprocity. Now, talking about the free market, and if we look at, you know, and we're all into this together, but is it conceivable and in any way sustainable that you have the wage gap between the owner of the supermarket chain and the person who works the till? So it's you know, those types of things where it becomes in some ways very close to the idea of Ubuntu. And I am a great protagonist of Ubuntu. The problem is that I'm going to start a movement. I've actually started a movement which I want to say Ubuntu is a great idea. I am contemplating some research with my Nijenrode Dutch colleagues on Ubuntu, because it's probably the most sought after South African concept. If you go and Google Ubuntu, and I did that, then it gains 100,000
results,
links or results, yeah, or hits, yeah, every day. And then I ask myself, if we designed Ubuntu, then we should have a movement which says hashtag is this Ubuntu. Because if it cannot be Ubuntu, for example, if people are in dire poverty, but the mayor, the first thing the mayor who gets elected does is she or he goes and buys a luxury German or Swedish or English car. So I'm saying that it is putting yourself into the position of the other, thinking through the implications of what you are doing, and creating and sharing wealth. And if you look at that, we need to invest in a couple of things. We need to invest in education. But then we also need to invest in effective and ethical leadership and competent leadership. And that also links to the point that, you know, if the instrumentalities are not in place, then you can't reach the goals. Until we understand that we're all together in this, and talking about economic models, if you continuously keep people in a disadvantaged position through your policies and your governance, for example, and based on a terrible past, then you're going to pay a price. Somehow the system has a pushback. The system will create a lot of violence. The system will create a pushback of a lot of riots, and we see that happening. We saw it happening in the KZN issues last year.
Yeah.
So yes, we have to get into a situation where we think about the other with empathy, with compassion, and to find a way in which we balance all of these things.
There's a question based on what you've said here, Erwin. Are there useful examples of states that have been able to move from pervasive ideologies of greed towards more positive guiding ideologies? Is there a pattern of reversal that could be emulated? And he says Ubuntu undoubtedly holds promise, but seems to collapse into an ideology of forgiveness rather than of accountability.
Yeah, once again, very wise and profound questions. I would argue there is no such thing as a perfect state. There are different states, and states have to adapt to their situations and to their context. What I can say is that globally and in the literature, it seems to be that the Scandinavian countries, given a particular context, they were examples of states that evolved in a particular way. And whether it's sustainable is another story, but there was some form of political economic dynamic which started to work with a big issue of creating and sharing public wealth in ways which become constructive, ethical, and effective. I would always, and this is my bias, I would always involve also my good friends from the Netherlands, where I'm more or less very much involved, as you know. And if you think what the Netherlands had to do after the Second World War, and currently it's a small country, the geographic size, but also if you look at it, it's small in size, not a large population, and growing in terms of its tolerance, which it always had, and its inclusivity. And you can go to all of the important indicators of global success, and you will find the Netherlands, this fairly small country, with not a big population, but with an attitude that says we need to create and share wealth, and they are in the top 10 of all of the indexes in the world, of all of the indexes that point in the right directions. So there are examples. There's no perfection, but you can do much better than we are currently doing. And hopefully we are seeing what I called the president's blooms after the fire or the burn.
So
okay.
I'm going. The questions are coming in on the side here, but I just want to quickly circle back before I take these questions, Erwin. You spoke of our president speaking. You said blossoms after the fire, and one of the sounds of the images of blossom is this notion of a social compact. So for our audience, directors, business people sitting out there in terms of governance, they sit in business, they risk their money. So they look from business to government, they look for this, let's call it the social compact. We will invest the money and the profits that we will make in the country. We will employ people, but you must create education environment from which we can get skilled and educated people. You must give us a health environment for when our people get sick or ill, that they can be treated in that environment. You must create a fair playing ground out there so that you are not more fair to certain businesses or entities than you are to others. And in doing that, we will employ, and from our coffers, we will pay the tax, and we will circulate this into an economic system with you in that space. But it is as if business is feeling, but that side of the social compact is not coming forward.
Well, I will start again, Frick, with blossoms after the burn or blossoms after the fire. In the latest State of the Nation address, a very interesting ideological shift occurred. for the first time, as far as I can remember, the president of the country and the president of the ANC said the state doesn't create jobs. The private sector primarily creates jobs. Obviously, the state creates employment, but the creation of productive and let's say value creating jobs is the function of the private sector. And the social compact idea is also linked to another concept which I've already put out there, and that is the one of a competent developmental state. And that is what we should all contribute to, but it's not also a contribution which is based on a form of shall we say, arrogance and superiority. And the state in South Africa can be very arrogant and very superior, but so the private sector. We should start blaming and shaming, or stop blaming and shaming, and see how can we actually start to work on a co-creative partnership to co-create and share public value. And that will take more than another summit. It will take the building of trust, and it will take a long-standing kind of well, start with a low-hanging fruit. Just for example, sort out home affairs, or SARS. We've turned around. Remember, we've also lost a lot of legitimacy and trust in our institutions through the corruption that we've had. So that gradually has to become a situation where we build a trusting, legitimate, co-creating, effective and ethical partnership, and it's not going to happen overnight. But with your permission, can I quickly just tackle another strand? I'm also watching the time, and I would like to just position this.
Okay.
Because how do you become, and I call it on becoming and being compromised, the why and where to of a compromised citizenry. Now, this is a process which in South Africa, if you study it, it was a slow poisoning through contamination. You know, we all started out going to heaven, and gradually we moved into the other way. And it didn't happen overnight, but it's a dynamic, and that dynamic starts to create a set of behavioral incentives where if those incentives are wrongly led and managed, then they create rewards and punishment in a way which starts to reward bad behavior. So it's a slow process. If you see that your colleague or comrade is successful being corrupt and there's no consequences, then obviously that becomes a way to succeed. And that process starts with that contamination, and then secondly, it becomes a compromise. And here comes a compromise. It's a compromise which soothes the conscience. Well, the leaders do it, we can all do it, or it's the only way out, and it becomes ambiguous. That then sort of leads into the idea that you know, we are all compromised, and we can in actual fact lower our standards, and we can all participate because everybody else does it, and then the feeding frenzy ensues. Everybody has to get their snouts into the trough, and the trough is becoming emptier and emptier because there's a downward spiral. We're not creating wealth, we're only sharing it, and we're not creating it effectively or ethically. We're sharing it ineffectively and unethically. And I mean, integrity is not only about morals, it's about money. The transaction costs of being corrupt is that you have to hide the 1 million rands in a bank in probably Dubai or somewhere, and the transaction costs are extremely high because you can't do it in the open on a market. It becomes 100,000 through the transaction cost. So this idea that morality doesn't cost, there is a notion in the South African public domain, not necessarily the public sector only, that, you know, when you perpetrate corruption, it's a victimless crime. That's absolute nonsense. It creates victims of everybody, and you into your feeding frenzy. So if that happens, then life becomes solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. And possibly, once again, that apocalyptic scenario of a disastrous war of all against all, where compromise is achieved, the compromise for the bottom spiral, the spiraling to the bottom, is achieved very successfully and completed, and disaster is delivered. If we are not very careful and we don't start to think about what we think and really interrogate where we are in this situation and build a social compact and start to reinvent and re-engineer our society, which includes politics, economics, technology, social dimensions, and the ecology, then we could end up in what I call the disaster delivered. Let me stop there. We've got 15 minutes. Maybe there are people who want. Normally when I teach in a live situation, I move around because people throw things at me, and it's difficult to hit a moving target.
Erwin, as you speak about, I'm going to come to a question in this Brabant here, but as you speak about apocalyptic, I think we had a small preview of that in what happened in KZN last year. If that happens on a national level, we are exactly at that war of all against all in that process. Here's a question linking to this, coming from an educational angle. If it's taken a generation for the degeneration into the kind of corruption we have, who takes the lead in educating the populace of the kind of ideology that is growth-minded and accountable, as this will surely take a generation or two to bring or turn the ship around?
Well, the answer is, in that sense, maybe oversimplifies all of us. All of us. This is not the work. Obviously it calls for symbolic and in that sense symbolic leadership, which in many ways under the Zuma disaster we didn't have. But now it's all of our responsibility. We also have to share that, and that's not a burden, that's a pleasure. We must share that pleasure of leading through our example. Remember that Frick, and I'm talking to directors here, and I'm not sure how many people from the public sphere of life is here, politicians and public administration people, but you know, corruption and prostitution have one thing in common. There's always another party involved. So you can talk about the state is corrupt. Well, it takes somebody to corrupt the state. You can say that South Africa is corrupt, but I said to a German, we wouldn't have had an arms deal corruption, if there weren't German industrialists bribing people. Now, it's not proven in the court because there's another corruption. You use the Constitution to protect yourself, the Constitution. But those are the things that happen. But the answer, the fairly simple, but I don't think oversimplified answer is we all have a responsibility. Start to exercise your responsibility. Do what you can. Be with integrity. Be compassionate. Be empathetic, and also reciprocity. Give something back. Don't always take. And start to build some form of Ubuntu, which is not about only a kind of symbolic situation. Frick.
So that brings us to the notion of the responsibility of citizens of this country, not only every 4 years when we vote, but in between as well, in how we conduct ourselves with integrity, empathy, and compassion in conducting business, in teaching, in admin, in whatever.
Yeah. Frick, I have maybe just a final point, which will take me 2 or 3 minutes, and then we have a couple of minutes left. And this I call, what are the capacity requirements and the change requirements for an uncompromised citizenry? We must hold up a light of hope as well. And of course, that exactly comes into, we should all start to think about what we think. We should act with integrity, compassion, empathy, and reciprocity. And we must move from what I will call a potentially vicious society, where there's enough evidence of viciousness, to a virtuous society. And that does call for a moral compass. And the moral compass says that on the one side, towards the promised land, there's cohesion socially, there's cooperation, there's professional conduct. We do things that are legal and legitimate. We act in a just and ethical way. We act in a moral way.